It's my nerd world. What are you doing here? I'm just kidding. I invited you here, and I'm glad that you're here. Welcome to my Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. All right, on the show this week, Boba Fett confusion. Who's wearing the suit? Who's not wearing the suit? Maybe. What's Timothy Olyphant doing in The Mandalorian Season 2? Why is his last name that which was taken from The Lord of the Rings? I'm just kidding. We will give you that. That's a part of the news this week. Not a lot of news this week, but we will talk via Slash Film what Timothy Olyphant's alleged role is in The Mandalorian Season 2 and why it has to do potentially with the Boba Fett armor and what that means for Boba Fett and Tamura Morrison in The Mandalorian. So, Season 2, we'll get into that. Plus, it's been 40 years since arguably the most beloved Star Wars film of all time, The Empire Strikes Back, was released in theaters. I watched it this week, and I landed on a really interesting observation that may explain why, apart from it being a fantastic film, why it is one of the most beloved Star Wars movies. With that, we're also going to talk a little bit about the Rise of Skywalker, The Last Jedi, and The Force Awakens, since we're going to be looking back fondly at The Empire Strikes Back. And this very astute observation I came across. I want to talk a little bit about how the sequel trilogy is going to be perceived in years to come. And we have your listener feedback this week. So let us not waste any more time and get right to this week's My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast, brought to you by mynerdworld.net, where you can find the trilogy for the EMBARK science fiction space opera series.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
I am unafraid to say what a fan I am of The Rise of Skywalker. We're going to talk a little bit about it on the show this week because I can't help but talk about this movie. All right, also we're going to get into the news I mentioned before of what Timothy Olyphant's character might be in Mandalorian Season 2. And we're going to look back at The Empire Strikes Back at an observation that I made watching the film this week. Welcome to My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast, and I am your host, Jon Justice. I want to encourage you to join the mailing list simply by emailing me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, and say, John, put me on the list. It'll give you details about upcoming My Nerd World podcasts and future releases and current releases in the EMBARK science fiction space opera series, which the full trilogy of EMBARK Book 1, Book 2, Treasure in Darkness, and Book 3, The Vanishing War, are all now available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Audiobook for Book 3 coming out here in the next few weeks. So go on by mynerdworld.net for all things My Nerd World and EMBARK. There was a very interesting interview on the Resistance broadcast with J.W. Rinsler. And we'll get a little bit more into this later on. I want to mention it now so I don't forget because it's not actually in my notes. And I just remembered it as I started the show. But J.W. Rinsler talked about, he wrote the definitive book on The Empire Strikes Back and interviewed and talked to George Lucas a ton about the original trilogy. And it's fascinating to hear J.W. Rinsler talk about how much that George Lucas made up on the fly when it came to that original trilogy. And one of the hosts on the Resistance broadcast was very keen to point out, and I'm glad that he did, that, even George Lucas he had outlines, but did not have a definitive vision on specific details when it came to the sequel trilogy. And this is obviously something that has not rested well with fans of the Disney Lucasfilm era Star Wars movies. Now, I personally believe that this has a lot to do with social networking. And I've talked about this a lot on the show, but I think that in the absence, if you remove social networking from the equation, these movies are looked at in a much different light. And are perhaps more well-received than they would have been. Certainly would not have been nearly as controversial without the ability for those controversies in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker to spread across the internet like a pandemic novel coronavirus spreading across the globe, right? I really do think that it would be treated much differently. And this is going to play into a bit of the conversation that we're going to have when we look back at The Empire Strikes Back and sort of, pose the question of how will the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker, be perceived in years to come. Give you a bit of a preview. I am an optimist, and I think they're going to be received better than they are now. Apart from perhaps Episode 7. All right, so we'll get into that in a little bit. First off, though, we do have just one piece of news to share with you before we dive into why The Empire Strikes Back is still loved 40 years later, and an observation that I made watching The Empire Strikes Back this week in honor of its 40-year anniversary.
Will you have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down?
So we've had a ton of casting news for The Mandalorian Season 2, and covered that quite extensively on last week's show. We talked quite a bit about Temuera Morrison and him returning to the role of Boba Fett, maybe? Could he be playing Rex? Okay, Slash Film has an exclusive. Timothy Olyphant will wear Boba Fett's iconic armor in The Mandalorian Season 2. Peter Serretta penned this particular article that I am going to share with you. So it was revealed last week. Justified, Deadwood, Scream 3, Go, love the movie Go, Die Hard, Live Free or Die Hard villain, right? Timothy Olyphant has been cast in The Mandalorian for an unknown role. Olyphant's casting is a story that Slash Film and Peter Serretta have been chasing and trying to confirm. And while they didn't get to break the news, they do have some information regarding the character that he might be playing in The Mandalorian Season 2, and why he's wearing Boba Fett's iconic armor. So here's the breakdown. Our sources, says Slash Film, have confirmed that Olyphant filmed scenes wearing Boba Fett's Mandalorian armor for the upcoming season of The Mandalorian. It might sound confusing because earlier this month it was reported that Temuera Morrison, who originated the role of Jango Fett, Boba's clone father, had been cast as Boba Fett. So what's going on? So if Morrison is playing the role of Boba Fett, then Timothy Olyphant is playing an enigmatic character named Cobb Vanth. Introduced in Chuck Wendig's Aftermath book series, Vanth is a self-appointed sheriff of the Tatooine-based settlement Freetown. He wears a mysterious set of Mandalorian armor that was acquired from Jawas, who scavenged the wreckage of Jabba the Hutt's sail barge shortly after the events of Return of the Jedi. As you may recall, that was the site of the battle where Boba Fett was thrown into the Sarlacc pit. It's assumed the Mandalorian purchased by Vanth is none other than the infamous green armor formerly worn by one of the galaxy's most notorious bounty hunters, Boba Fett. Now, very little has been revealed about Vanth's backstory, only that he was once a slave, as evidenced by a star-shaped scar carved into his back, signifying ownership. With the fall of the gangster Jabba the Hutt, a power vacuum has consumed Tatooine, drawing all sorts of crime syndicates to take over the unruled landscape. Cobb has committed his life in the service to protecting Freetown and keeping criminal elements like Red Key Raiders away from Tatooine. He even struck a deal with the Tusken Raiders to help protect the township. It should be noted that all of the above character details were revealed during the Aftermath book series. We don't know what part he plays in the upcoming season of The Mandalorian, but I think the books offer a rad setup for the character. The Aftermath series gave the impression that while Boba Fett may be dead, the iconic armor would live on for another generation. But if Fett himself is still alive and present in The Mandalorian Season 2, this complicates things. So, in The Mandalorian Season 1 episode, The Gunslinger, a mysterious figure was teased sporting the bounty hunter's trademark spurs. In that episode, the Mandalorian agrees to help a young bounty hunter named Toro Calican acquire a target on the desert planet of Tatooine. Their search for the assassin, Fennec Shand, takes them across the Dune Sea, home of the Sarlacc pit that was once thought to have killed Boba Fett. Calican takes out Shand and tries to double-cross the Mandalorian, leading to his own death. In the final moments of the episode, we see a mysterious character approaching the seemingly lifeless body of Fennec Shand. We can see and hear the bounty hunter's trademark spurs and a cape that hangs down, reminiscent of one Fett may have worn. Is that character Boba Fett, or is that Cobb Vanth? Was Fett's Mandalorian armor reclaimed by the Jawas after the Sarlacc pit? After the Sarlacc spit them out, or did Boba Fett pawn them for a ride off Tatooine? Morrison's casting led many to assume this meant that Boba Fett had survived the fall into the great pit of Carkoon, forever changing Star Wars canon. But that might not be the case at all. Maybe Fett's appearance could be limited to an establishing flashback. The hardworking team at The Hollywood Reporter even noted that it was only a small role in Season 2. But why would Vanth be all the way out in the Dune Sea? Perhaps this season may be leading to a confrontation between Vanth and Fett, with this bounty hunter coming back to reclaim his armor. And how will any of this involve the Mandalorian? We'll have to tune in to find out. They reached out to Lucasfilm but couldn't get a comment. Reading this, I have a bit of a hard time just on its face thinking that there would be a confrontation between Vanth and Fett, just because the show is so Din Djarin Mandalorian focused that seems to me that he would obviously have to be involved in that situation in some way, shape, or form, right? It also brings up the question, too, when it comes to the Mandalorian armor and Fett and the Mandalorians in the Mandalorian show. And, this is the way. They are very much true believers. It could just be that Tamira Morrison is playing Rex, which would make somewhat sense when you consider that there's been the rumor of Sabine, but more specifically Ahsoka Tano. Or it could be, as suggested here, that Tamira Morrison actually is playing Boba Fett and comes back to get his armor again. So, needless to say, all of this we don't have to wait too long for, thankfully, because it's coming out later this year. And then, secondly, it also is... I'm losing my train of thought here. Look, it just means we're ramping up to a really amazing season of The Mandalorian that I'm very much, looking forward to. The cast of this has gotten really big. I think the show is going to grow a lot. And as I mentioned in a previous episode as well, I really do expect that The Mandalorian is going to follow a bit of what has happened in Star Wars, and that is sort of the growth of the films as they roll along. And looking at the original trilogy, and especially as I'm about to talk about The Empire Strikes Back, I really do think The Mandalorian could take on a very similar sort of vibe. And it's interesting, too, because the production of The Mandalorian seems to be following very similarly to the original Star Wars, where that original Star Wars movie very much was groundbreaking, limited by its budget, and kind of indie film. And the original the Mandalorian Season 1 also seems to have a bit of that sort of that vibe of we're going to try this new technology, right? Which is the focus of the next Mandalorian gallery that just came out today on Disney+. They're really experimenting with the screen backgrounds and being able to do these shots that look so real, but they're just done on a small set. And I think that the Mandalorian Season 1 was such a success, we're going to see the budget increase and the show expand just like we did with the original trilogy heading into The Empire Strikes Back. All right. Other than that, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. What are your thoughts on Cobb Vanth wearing the Boba Fett armor? Do you think that we're going to get Boba Fett in the series, or is that going to be left a mystery for us to ponder on whether or not he actually died and he's just wearing the suit? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com is the email address. What do you think?
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
It's amazing that it's been 40 years since the release of The Empire Strikes Back. And I was 7 going on 8 years old when that movie first came out. I still remember sitting on the shag-ish, brownish carpet of the home I lived in and grew up in Arcadia, California, on Tree Lane Avenue, sitting on the floor and watching this little square TV. Probably wasn't even a 19-inch at that point in time, and seeing an ad for The Empire Strikes Back on TV. And the only thing that I remember from the ad was seeing Vader's helmet and then the blue Empire Strikes Back logo. And I want to go back to this interview that I heard on the Resistance broadcast with J.W. Rinsler, and how fascinating it was to hear him talk about how loosely George Lucas created that original trilogy and kind of made things up as he went along and changed dialogue as he went along, and the nature of a Force ghost and how that kind of came up on the fly. And he really was making things up as he created those movies, even though he had an outline. And as a matter of fact, J.W. Rinsler even says that George Lucas wanted it that way. He wanted the films to be like James Bond, where different people directed the movies. And that's essentially what's happened with Disney and Lucasfilm. And according to J.W. Rinsler, he also wanted to create the movies in such a way to where he could leave himself open for changes and keep it fresh. He didn't want everything mapped out because he felt that it was more fun and exciting to discover things as he went along in creating the story process. And I talked about this on the self-publishing podcast, but when you write books, there's kind of two different writers. There's a pantser, which means you sort of write by the seat of your pants, and that's what I do, right? I have a rough outline in my head, but I don't really know what's going to happen in my stories until I sit down and start writing them. And I just allow my mind to take me where the story is going to go, and I craft the story from there. And then you have plotters. Plotters are individuals that just lay out the whole book in plotted form, and they write that way. There is no right or wrong way to do it. It's just personal preference. But George Lucas seemed like he was a pantser when it come to making the movies. He wanted to leave it open. And I was even watching the 30-year Conversation with the Masters documentary about The Empire Strikes Back on YouTube yesterday, and it's even alluded to in there, the number of changes that were made in the script as they went along. Things that you and I would think George had locked down and planned that have become so important, like Yoda. Yoda saying, no, there is another towards the end of The Empire Strikes Back. That actually changed. He hadn't landed on that yet. I mean, the whole Luke and Leia situation he hadn't landed on. And I only bring that up as we get into this, not so much about The Empire Strikes Back, but when I talk about the sequel trilogy and all of the negativity that the sequel trilogy has received from the fandom inside of social media and on YouTube from people that feel like they shouldn't have flown by the seat of their pants, right? And I disagree. I love the way the sequel trilogy played out. The movies can be different, but they still are very much connected, and ultimately they go and they make sense. So I sat down to watch The Empire Strikes Back, And I was kicking myself in the head a little bit when I went to go do the show this week because I had intended to continue doing the rewatching series, which I am going to do on the show, and it didn't even occur to me that if I had kept with my time frame and I had done a rewatching of A New Hope on the podcast last week, that I would have landed on this week, the 40-year anniversary of doing the rewatching of The Empire Strikes Back. But that didn't happen. So this does not count as the rewatching of The Empire Strikes Back. I am still going to do podcasts specifically devoted to the next 6 movies, and I will eventually do Solo and Rogue One as well. But for this podcast, I just want to talk about sort of the impact of The Empire Strikes Back, and specifically something that I noticed watching it this last just yesterday. Okay, so let me get to what I'm talking about and quit dancing around the issue. I do love The Empire Strikes Back. It is one of my favorite Star Wars films. It is my favorite of the original trilogy. And as I've stated at the moment, The Rise of Skywalker, for the time being, is still my favorite Star Wars movie. And then right after that would be The Last Jedi, and then probably I'd go Empire Strikes Back. But I'm done sort of ranking the films because my opinions and views change depending on the days, the weeks, the years, or the seasons. Okay. But The Empire Strikes Back will always hold a special place in my heart. And I didn't quite understand why until I watched it yesterday. And then I realized something. The opening of that film always gives me shivers. Always gives me goosebumps, right? The camera pan down from after the crawl, and then the opening music, the dun 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 dun, right? And then pew, pew, pew. You get the Star Destroyer rolls up on the screen, and then you have the probe droids being launched from the belly of it and then landing on Tatooine. You got the Tauntaun rolling up, right? There's something about that opening music, those opening shots heading down to Hoth that just always, it just sends positive shivers up my spine. And I finally figured out what it was. The reason why it does that for me, and I think the reason why The Empire Strikes Back is held in such high regard, is that The Empire Strikes Back was something and did something that the original Star Wars didn't. The original Star Wars, A New Hope, right? When it was released in theaters, it was just Star Wars, right? Episode 4. We didn't know what we were in for. It was brand new, right? Nobody had heard of this thing. You're talking about an all-new original story. We've discussed, and it's been talked at length about the time period, especially in America at the time, at that time in the 70s. And this movie comes out, and it just captures the cultural. It just captures the culture, right? It becomes a part of the zeitgeist. It's a phenomenon. It's one of the first blockbusters, and that first Star Wars just launches this thing that nobody had ever seen before. I mean, it was viral before anything had ever been viral or anybody even thought of that. It became this massive, massive thing. Then The Empire Strikes Back comes out. And what is The Empire Strikes Back? It's another Star Wars movie after the original Star Wars movie. And just like every movie that comes out from Star Wars, because they are held with in such high regard and cherished by so many millions of people, everybody goes into a Star Wars film, right? In my opinion, most everybody goes into a Star Wars film optimistic about what they're about to get because of our love of Star Wars, okay? The Empire Strikes Back was the first one that did that. You know that feeling when you go see a Star Wars movie, any Star Wars movie for the first time, right? There's nothing quite like it, right? That anticipation, that nervousness, that excitement. What am I going to see? Your desire to just soak everything up on screen, right? I know I'm not the only one that does this, right? You're just going in there just wide-eyed, just, bring it on. Let me see it. What is this going to be? How is this going to open? What's going to happen? The Empire Strikes Back was the first time we got to experience that. We had just gone through and become fans of this galaxy far, far away in Star Wars. And we spent, a few years of the movie being re-released and the fandom just growing and getting bigger and getting the toys and the horrible holiday special, right? And you know, all the merchandise surrounding it, the T-shirts and the posters, right? This thing, and then we're like, oh my gosh, we're getting another one. They're making another Star Wars at a time when sequels constantly failed. Sequels didn't work. You know, you point to Jaws 2 as an example, and there was a couple other mention that I heard on another podcast, but you know, sequels generally speaking didn't work, and so there's this nervousness. And then The Empire Strikes Back hits the screen, and not only are we wide-eyed and our jaws dropped and just hanging on every note of John Williams' score and every piece of dialogue coming from the actors and every sound effect of every ship and X-Wing and TIE Fighter and the Millennium Falcon and AT-ATs and all this. We get this phenomenal movie that just takes what Star Wars was, what we knew of one movie of Star Wars, and just takes it up to this next level. It's a darker film. It's a more character-driven film. It's a film that doesn't have a resolution at the end that leaves you hanging on the end on the edge of your seat. It does what most films don't do, and it opens with the big space battle, right? Our heroes from the original movie end up getting their butts kicked during the film. And you didn't normally get that in movies. Usually sequels were just kind of a weak rehash of the movie that came before it that spawned the sequel. But most importantly, man, it was nostalgia. It was the first Star Wars movie that we did what we do now with all Star Wars movies. We look at it with awe and wonder on that first screening. And because it worked, I'm convinced that it just cemented itself in the minds of so many children and young adults and adults at the time, right, as being this truly special thing. It took what that original movie was that we fell in love with, and it kicked it up several notches. And every movie since then, every Star Wars film since then, you go into it for them. And again, I think I'm speaking for them. I'll speak about me. For me, every single Star Wars movie since then, I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's saga. I don't care if it's spin-off, and even television show or cartoon. You go into it just like, all right, I'm getting me some brand new Star Wars, and it just has that amazing feeling. But The Empire Strikes Back was the first one to ever do that. And I think that's why it's been cemented in the minds of so many fans as being the best Star Wars movie. Now, that's not to take away any of how great the film is, because the film really is spectacular. It still 100% holds up today. The shots in it are still fantastic. It doesn't, I mean, look, it looks older because of the the special effects. But even my son, Kyle, who's 13 years old, we were watching the beginning of it, and he was looking at the Tauntauns, and he goes, oh, you could totally tell that's CGI. And I laughed. I go, that's actually not CGI. That's a puppet. And the fact that you thought it was CGI is a testament to how good a job they did as, at making it a puppet. So that's why I think The Empire Strikes Back is, apart from it being an amazing film, right? It really, really is. But it's that first sort of grip on nostalgia. And I think that's different. I know a lot of people, a lot of fans, especially fans whose sort of first experience with Star Wars ends up being like Return of the Jedi. That movie is their favorite. But, look, in my opinion, Return of the Jedi is a much weaker film than The Empire Strikes Back was. It just is. And I've mentioned it before. It's probably one of my least favorite Star Wars movies, even though I love them. I love them all. I'm getting a renewed appreciation for Return of the Jedi, and I've mentioned this before, especially because Return of the Jedi does try to do new things and different things. I do think that it has some of the worst shots in all of the original trilogy, especially some of the matte paintings that take place towards the end of the film as everybody kind of goes on their way to do different things. But it just wasn't nearly as strong as The Empire Strikes Back, which, again, further cemented The Empire Strikes Back in the minds of, so many fans as being the best Star Wars movie. Now, what'll be interesting to me is when we go and we look back at the sequel trilogy years down the line. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about episodes 7, 8, and 9.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that,
And I'll be really interested to see, as the years go by, how the sequel trilogy fares in the minds of the fandom. This is sort of my hot take on all three movies now that they've been out, and I've spent quite a bit of time with all three of these movies, all three of which I love. And I'm going to do it. I was going to work in reverse order, but I'll do it in chronological order, and we'll talk a bit about The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens is less ambitious than Episodes 8 and 9. There's no doubt about that. How will history look back on Episode 7? I think that history is going to look back on Episode 7 in a lot of ways the way people look back at A New Hope. A New Hope will always be the movie that launched Star Wars, right? But it rarely lands on the majority of lists of number one Star Wars films. It's, A New Hope is very minimalist by comparison to all the other Star Wars movies, being a product of the time when it was made. Still an incredible movie. The Force Awakens, to me, does the job that it needed to do. J.J. Abrams needed to thread the needle of nostalgia while keeping it fresh, while making it fast-paced for a modern audience, and establishing a foothold that Star Wars is back with this sort of never-spoken, perhaps, intention of recapturing the magic that a lot of people thought was lost with the prequels, right? And it does that very well. But it doesn't really do much else than that. There's a subtext to it, right, that pays off in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker with this very subtle building of the dyad between Rey and Kylo Ren, which obviously a lot of people picked up on that I didn't really pick up on until I heard other people talking about it and then went into The Last Jedi. And I thank those individuals who really saw that connection early on. Not to say I didn't see the connection there, but I didn't put a lot of weight and stock into it until later on as I heard other people's opinions and really begin to break down that they picked up on how important that relationship was going to be moving forward, right? But I really do think that Episode 7 is going to be looked at much like A New Hope is. People are going to say they really enjoyed it, they liked it, but it's not going to land on anyone's number one list of Star Wars movies, especially when you're ranking the sequel trilogy. You move over to The Last Jedi, that's going to be the most interesting one in my opinion, even though at the moment I actually like The Rise of Skywalker a little bit more, and I'll get into that. The Last Jedi is a masterpiece in my opinion, okay? I think that Rian Johnson did something truly amazing, special, and different. And The Last Jedi is very different. And to me, it is one of the... It still feels very Star Wars to me, but not in the same way that The Rise of Skywalker does. Like, when I was watching The Empire Strikes Back, I wasn't getting Last Jedi vibes. I was getting Rise of Skywalker vibes, and vice versa. And I'll talk about this in a bit. The Last Jedi is one of the most adult of Star Wars films, in my opinion. I know Rian Johnson included a little bit of jokey jokes in there, but the themes in it are pretty deep. And the character development in that movie is also pretty deep, right? It's pretty thick with its subtext, and it does it really, really well. We've talked about sort of the cinematography of the movie is gorgeous and beautiful, but it's got a muted tone on top of it. It's a very long film that is epic, but it's not epic. Like, The Last Jedi to me has the most in common with The Empire Strikes Back in terms of the plotting, right? Sort of the most expansive and epic that you get ends up being the Canto Bight sequences, which I now really, really love. I think The Last Jedi will very much be not only perceived better in the future, despite dividing the fandom, it'll also be more well-received in the future, not just being a Star Wars movie, but being just a movie in and of itself, which I don't necessarily think you can say apart from The Empire Strikes Back, right? And those two, I do see a connection and a comparison of The Empire Strikes Back and The Last Jedi, because I think those two movies in and of themselves are ones that will be separated from the Star Wars franchise to be looked at individually as great films, even though they're a part of a great franchise. They're great films on their own. And while Rise of Skywalker I find absolutely the most entertaining of all the sequel trilogies, I also don't think that people will necessarily take The Rise of Skywalker and pull it out and say by itself it's a fantastic movie. I would, because I think that it is, and I'll get to that in just a second. The Last Jedi, though, is a very unique and bold film, and I think that that's the way that it will be looked at years upon years down the line. There'll be a lot of caveats placed for individuals exposing Star Wars to somebody for the first time in years to come when showing them the sequel trilogy. I think there's going to be a lot of, okay, before you watch The Last Jedi, know this, right? This movie looks a little different. It feels a little different. It was a lot of controversy, so we just want you to prepare yourself going into it. I think that Last Jedi is probably the one that's going to have the most caveats placed upon it for individuals experiencing Star Wars for the first time. The Rise of Skywalker, I continue to love this movie more and more. I'm not going to wipe out on it. I've talked about The Rise of Skywalker a lot on this podcast. However, watching The Empire Strikes Back, and I've said this about The Rise of Skywalker, but The Empire Strikes Back does hold a place near and dear to my heart, and it brings up those nostalgic feelings. The soundtrack is spot on. The action sequence is spot on. The dialogue, spot on. Okay? The only other film that gives me those same type of vibes, and I actually get nostalgia vibes from it, is The Rise of Skywalker. It is a very special and unique movie, and where J.J. Abrams was threading the needle to do something very specific for The Force Awakens, he and Chris Terrio really went for it with The Rise of Skywalker, and in my opinion, they absolutely pulled it off. It is a tried and true Star Wars movie, in my opinion. It has all the elements. It's got a fantastic plot. It's got snappy, witty dialogue. The action sequences are spectacular. You have a subtext in the film and a depth of taking what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi and bringing it to another level with the dyad, with Rey and Kylo Ren and Ben. I know the controversy, and you can't talk about these films without talking about the controversy behind these movies. However, I am of the opinion that this is mostly social media and YouTube driven, and that all three of these movies, and especially episodes 8 and 9, would be received much differently right now in the fandom if it wasn't for social media. You simply cannot ignore the influence and impact voices have out on social networking and on YouTube, and the impact that it has on individuals' opinions that perhaps may have thought differently if they weren't broadsided with a bunch of different views. That's not to say that people can't go and share their own opinions. That is to say these movies have been nitpicked and torn apart to the nth degree, and I think they would be looked at much more fondly if that hadn't happened in the same way as the original trilogy was. I do believe that time will look back more fondly on The Rise of Skywalker as being a tried and true Star Wars film. It feels more Star Wars-y to me than The Last Jedi does. I'm just going to be honest. Even though I think The Last Jedi is a masterpiece. It is, for me, The Empire Strikes Back of the sequel trilogy to The Force Awakens being A New Hope in the sequel trilogy. And thankfully, we get this amazing piece of art wedged in between those two. And I don't think you get to The Rise of Skywalker, and I don't think that I enjoy The Rise of Skywalker nearly as much if it wasn't for what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi. I have not gotten sick of watching The Rise of Skywalker in the same way that I never get sick of watching The Empire Strikes Back. But hey, that's just me. What do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment on YouTube as well. Before we get to listener feedback, just want to remind you that you can support My Nerd World by going to mynerdworld.net and picking up your copy of the EMBARK science fiction series, an exciting mix of Fast and Furious, Star Wars, Ready Player One, and the sci-fi adventures of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. All three books are available right now in ebook and paperback. Audiobook for the first two, and the audiobook for the Vanishing War, Book 3, will be available in the next coming weeks. And again, if you support the show, that's the way to go and support it. Go and pick up a copy for you and a friend in either ebook or paperback of the EMBARK Science Fiction Series at mynerdworld.net. And remember, please, if you haven't done it already, leave me a review at Amazon.com for any of the books, but I definitely need them for Treasure in Darkness and for The Vanishing War. So if you can just take a moment, go on to Amazon. If you purchased a copy already, and leave me a positive review, I would very much appreciate it.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, let's get to the listener feedback this week. We'll talk to, we will not talk to. We will hear from Dale Erdman, who writes this. I don't think they're going for a time before the Skywalker saga in 2022, talking about the next movie. I'd love to see what Rey is, what she becomes or does after. If Thrawn, Ezra, and the Rebels cast don't, or even if they do, show up in The Mandalorian, I think they could easily continue with Rey. Yeah, you know what? I hope you're right, Dale, because I'd rather go forward than backwards. I've said that a lot. It'll be very interesting to see what that first 2022 movie is actually going to be. And I'm kind of leaning your direction. I kind of feel like Disney and Lucasfilm want to keep in the current timeline they've been playing in with the sequel trilogy, just because we've gone backwards so many times now. We're going to continue to do so with the Cassian Andor series. We're going to continue to do so with the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. We are with The Mandalorian. I hope you're right. I'm praying you're right. All right, J.O.B. writes this. My idea for episode 10, taking some cues from your ideas, John. It's been 10 years since the final defeat of Darth Sidious. Rey Skywalker has consumed the ancient Jedi texts and traveled to Coruscant with the assistance of Maz Kanata, located much of the Jedi archives. Rey is now a fully realized and seasoned Jedi master, but has never taken a Padawan. Now is the time to pass on what she's learned. When the student is ready, the master will appear. Rey Skywalker is being led by the living Force and is brought to a planet teeming with much life, so much that her Force ability is overwhelmed. Rey is led to a modest dwelling, and when she enters the building, she comes face to face with a child, a 100-year-old child. I'm in, J.O.B. I don't know what happens with the rest of your movie, but I'm in. Thank you for the email. All right, Brian Martin writes this. Are you worried about movie theaters dying out? Will they survive coronavirus? All right. I am not. And this is the reason why. And I won't wipe out on this, I promise. But for my full-time radio job, being a news talk radio host, I've done a lot of research on this. And there's some new data that's been coming out about the coronavirus that actually shows when you look at what took place on the USS Roosevelt, for those that follow the news and know about the aircraft carrier where coronavirus infected the entire crew, and also the Diamond Princess cruise ship that was in quarantine, you have two real-world Petri dish experiments that took place of people being isolated in one location, unable to leave, and the coronavirus spreading among them. The similarities of the way the virus spread on both of those ships shows that there was actually an 80% resistance rate to the coronavirus, meaning that the 80% of the almost 4,000 people on both those ships didn't actually get the virus or were asymptomatic of the virus. That actually brings the infection rate down from the R naught. The R naught is how the infection how a disease or virus gets spread. So the R naught for the flu is 1.2. So for every person that has the flu, 1.2 people are going to get it around them. They've speculated that the R naught for coronavirus, for COVID-19, is more along the lines of 2.4. If you take those two ships into account in the data, which most of the models don't, most of the models are accounting for everybody being able to get infected, and that's just not the case. The R naught, the replication rate of COVID-19, is actually 0.48. Okay, so I say all that because of this. There's been no signs of a second wave anywhere around the globe, and we probably would have seen it by now if there was going to be, which leads me to believe that eventually the coronavirus is actually going to meet extinction once we get a vaccine. Because it actually, while it's highly contagious, the R naught will be lower than the flu, in which case the flu sticks around, coronavirus won't. So, all that is to say, I'm not worried about theaters dying out, because eventually they're going to open theaters back up, and we'll all be able to go back out into the theaters and see films just like we did before. All right, let's move on. Thank you, Brian, for the question. Mr. Maz says this. On a previous episode, I talked about my buddy Zach over on the Knights of Vader podcast and how we were talking about Boba Fett and specifically individuals who think that characters like Captain Phasma didn't get their just desserts in the sequel trilogy, and I pointed out, well, look at how popular Boba Fett became, even though he was barely in the movies and barely had any speaking lines. Zach had a theory. His idea of why Boba Fett was so popular was because he had captured Han Solo. And that, while he didn't have a lot of screen time in The Empire Strikes Back, well, he's in all 3 movies now with the special editions, right? He shows up briefly in A New Hope. He's obviously in The Empire Strikes Back, and he's in for a brief time at the beginning of Return of the Jedi. But his argument was that, no, Boba Fett actually captured a hero in Han Solo, so he became infamous, and that's why a vast majority of fans, consciously or subconsciously, are such huge fans of Boba Fett. All right, Mr. Moz writes this. He says, that Boba Fett explanation as to why fans excuse his minimal role in the original trilogy while deriding the sequel trilogy for wasted characters doesn't wash for him. Fanboy's gonna fanboy, writes Mr. Moz. Boba Fett is nothing but a cool costume and always has been. They love pulling out the EU Legends material as to why Fett is so cool, but sorry, I don't care about some EU material catering to fans. Love it all you want, but if you have to pull out some comic book or game to justify something, it doesn't hold much merit in my opinion. I find bringing Fett back to be cheap fan service. All right. Mr. Moz is always good for an entertaining email. Yeah, I don't disagree, apart from the fan service part of it. I don't like the idea of fan service. Just because we end up liking something or they do something that they think fans will like, it gets called fan service, and I get tired. I get tired of that kind of argument. But again, I'm a very positive guy when it comes to Star Wars, in case you hadn't noticed. All right, Julianne writes this, but thank you, Mr. Moz, for the email. I appreciate it. Julianne writes this. In regards to Mark's comments, Mark Hamill, I remember him saying similar things for his voice work as the Joker for the Arkham games and the animated movies, talking about how he was done with Star Wars. He ended up voicing the Joker again for both mediums. I think if Star Wars needs him to come back, he would for voice work or to appear as a Force Ghost for Episode 10 or something like that. Because I agree with you when I want to see the continuation of Rey's journey. No matter what you think about the sequel trilogy, each movie did cross the $1 billion mark, and I just don't see Disney willing to let that go. I do not either. All right, and one more this week. It actually comes from Twitter. Thank you so much for your positivity about the Rise of Skywalker. It is my favorite Star Wars movie, and sometimes I feel sad because of the negativity surrounding it. Listening to the podcast makes me feel less bad for having it as my favorite, despite the harsh reviews and negativity. Thank you very much for that. Who's individual from Twitter, whose name I forgot to grab. I'm very sorry. I know it was a female, but I'm sorry I didn't grab your Twitter handle. I actually was supposed to include that in last week's show, and I didn't. So I apologize for that. So please leave me another comment on Twitter, and I'll give you the proper credit. All right, one more last comment on the Rise of Skywalker. I know I talk about it a lot, but the Rise of Skywalker to me is going back to the Panther idea, right? It really was J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio sitting back going, what would be cool? What do we want to see? Now, J.J. Abrams did that with The Force Awakens and with Lawrence Kasdan. Don't misunderstand. But I also think that J.J. Abrams was very much aware, and so was Lawrence Kasdan. They had a very specific job to do. It was a soft reboot of Star Wars, even though it was a continuation, right, of the saga movies. I really feel like The Rise of Skywalker was J.J. and Chris Terrio having to work with some difficult circumstances with the passing of Carrie Fisher, knowing they had to close out the Rey and Kylo Ren storyline, but it was these two individuals just wanting to make a movie that they would love. And that's what I love about it. I feel the excitement and the passion of the creators when I watch that movie. And to me, it shows in every single frame, and it pulls out all the stops. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to do something I don't normally do, and I'm even going to strip away any criticism I had at the end of the film in the end battle. Just like in the beginning of the movie, when I felt like it was paced too quickly, I do not feel that way anymore. I love the pacing at the start of the film, and that end battle is fantastic, right? Could I have had a few more seconds of ship flying shots here and there? Absolutely. But on further viewings, I realized that it was actually less about the space battle going on or the air battle going on than it was about the incursion onto the Star Destroyer, which is just fantastic. And the final moments of the movie, all the stuff with Ben Solo and Rey, leading to them getting their butts kicked before Rey stands up with the power of all the Jedi and takes out Palpatine. Spoiler alert. And then what Finn and Jannah do when they get that gun turned on the command deck of the Star Destroyer, and just the powerful, those powerful cannons just blowing it up, to them being rescued. It's just such amazing filmmaking. I absolutely love that movie. Can you tell how much I love that? How much I love that movie?
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?
Yeah, I have. It's Jon Justice loving The Rise of Skywalker. All right, that's it for the show this week. I hope that you are happy. I hope that you are well, and I hope you feel like I'm feeling, and that is that we're beginning to get out of this horrible situation that we've all been in for so long. It's a slow process, but I feel like we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel in all this. And hopefully the podcast can provide you a little bit of a distraction from all of it. Again, speaking of distractions, if you haven't picked up my science fiction space opera series and you're looking for something to distract you from life, please, by all means, go to mynerdworld.net or to Amazon.com and search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK. As a matter of fact, I just got an email from Stuart who said, I just wanted to say I loved The Vanishing War, your latest book. I've been in the mood for a bit of escapism, and this provided me an outlet. I look forward to the next installments. And the reviews have really been spectacular on the book. There hasn't been a lot, and I need more reviews. So if you've read the books and you like them and you have not left a review yet, please go on over to Amazon.com and leave a review today. It would really mean the world to me. Or pick up a copy for yourself or a friend. Again, Amazon.com, search for Jon, Jon Justice. If you love Star Wars and sci-fi, trust me, you'll love these books, and they're great for all ages. My 13-year-old just finished The Vanishing War and really enjoyed it, and is clamoring for me to finish book 4, which I'm in the process of working on right now, along with editing the audiobook. Have yourself a fantastic week. I look forward to hearing from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or again, leave a comment up on YouTube, and I will talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you. Always.
My Nerd World.